The game is starting.
Game started.
I laugh in the face of danger! Stand and deliver. I pledge my loyalty.
This had better be worth it. This had better be worth it.
Fresh, cool ale here.
This is more like it.
Wait till you see me in
Tread
action.
lightly. Finally. This is more like it. Finally. What is it now? Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it. Finally. Frostmourne hungers. Ah, at last. Frostmourne
Aye.
hungers.
You're interrupting my calculations.
Speak, fool. Tread lightly.
Give me something to do.
Speak, fool. Ah, at last. Tread lightly. This is more like it. Finally. Ah, at last. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it. Finally. No one orders me around. Ah, at last. Finally. This is more like it. Ah, at last. Frostmourne hungers. What is it now? Tread lightly. Ah, at last. What is it now? Finally. This is more like it. Ah, at last. Frostmourne hungers. Speak, fool. This is more like it. Ah, at last. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. Ah, at last. This is more like it. Ah, at last. Frostmourne hungers. Ah, at last. Frostmourne hungers. What is it now? Finally. Frostmourne hungers. Ah, at last. Frostmourne hungers.
Our brethren's town is under attack.
Ah, at last. Finally. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. Tread lightly. Finally. Ah, at last. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. Ah, at last. Finally. Ah, at last. Frostmourne hungers. Ah, at last. Finally. Frostmourne hungers.
Your pain shall be
Finally. Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it. Finally. This is more like it. Ah, at last. This is more like it. Finally. This is more like it.
First blood.
Frostmourne hungers. Ah,
Our
at
brethren's
last.
town is under attack.
This is more like it. Finally. Ah, at last. Finally. Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it. No one orders me around. Ah, at last.
You will know endless.
Frostmourne hungers. Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. Finally. Ah, at last. Finally. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. Ah, at last. Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. Finally. Frostmourne hungers. Finally. Ah, at last. Finally. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. Ah, at last. Speak, fool. Frostborn hungers. At last. Frostborn hungers. Finally. Frostborn hungers. At last. This is what for the Lich. Finally. Tread lightly. At last. Finally. Frostborn hungers. Finally. Frostborn hungers. What is it now? This is more like it. At last. This is more like it. Finally. At last. Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. At last. Frostborn hungers.
Our reference town is under attack.
Last, Frostborn hungers. At last, Frostborn hungers. Your pain shall be legendary. This is more like it. At last. Speak, fool. This is more like it. At last. This is more like it. At last. Frostborn hungers. At last, Frostborn hungers. At last, Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. Finally, this is more like it. At last, this is more like it. At last, Frostborn hungers. Finally, at last.
Our forces are under attack.
At last. Finally. No one orders me around. At last. Frostborn hungers. At last. Finally. At last. What is it now? No one orders me.
More gold is required.
Finally. Speak. Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. What is it now?
Our brethren's town is under attack.
Frostborn hungers. Finally. At last. Frostborn hungers. At last. Finally. At last. Finally. This is more like it.
Glory to the scourge.
Finally. At last. This is more like it. Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. At last. Frostborn hungers. At last. No one orders me. This is more like it. Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. Frostborn hungers. This is more like it.
Our brethren's
at
town
last.
is under attack.
Finally. This is more like it. At last.
Dominating. town is under attack.
What is it now? No one orders me around. Tread lightly. Frostborn hunger. Treat the scalpel. This is more like it. Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. Finally. Frostborn hungers. At last. Dominating. This is more like it. Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. Finally. Frostborn hungers. Finally. Frostborn hungers. At last. This is more like it. At last.
Town is under attack.
Frostborn hungers. At last. Frostborn hungers. Finally. This is more like it. At last. Finally. Frostborn hungers. At last. This is more like it. Frostborn hungers. Finally. This is more like it. At last. Finally. This is killing spree. Frostborn hungers. Finally. Frostborn hungers. No one orders me around. This is more like it. Tread lightly. Frostborn hungers. At
Our
last.
brethren's town is under attack.
Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. At last. Frostborn hungers. Finally. This is more like it. Finally. This is more like it. At last. This is more like it. Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. Finally. Frostborn hungers. You will know anything. This is more like it. At last. This is more like it. Frostborn hungers. Finally. This is more like it. Frostborn hungers. This is
Our
more like
brethren's town is under
it.
attack.
No one orders me around. Tread lightly. Finally. Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. Finally. Frostborn hungers. At last. This is more like it. Finally. This is more like it. Frostborn hungers. No one orders me around. Finally. What is it?
Unstoppable double kill. Dominating. Unstoppable.
Frostborn hungers. Finally. At last. Frostborn hungers. At last. Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. Frostborn hungers. At last.
Our brethren's
This is
town
more
is under
like it.
attack.
Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. At last. This is more like it. Now. For the Lich.
Our
At
brethren's
last.
town is under attack.
No one orders me around. This is more like it. Finally. At last. Finally. Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. Finally. Frostborn hungers. At last. This is more like it. At last. This is more like it. At last. Frostborn hungers. At last. Finally. At last. Frostborn hungers.
Our brethren's town is under attack.
Speak, fool. Tread lightly. Glory to the scourge. At last.
Wicked sick.
This is what
You will know endless.
at last. This is more like it. At last. Faithless coward. What is it now? This is more like it. Frostborn hunger. Finally.
You will know endless torment.
Frostborn hunger. At last. This is more like it. At last. Frostborn hungers. Finally. Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. Tread lightly. Faithless coward. Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. Finally. Speak, fool. At last. This is more like it. At last. Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. No one orders me around. At last. Finally. At last. Finally. At last. This is more like it.
Your pain shall be legendary.
At last. This is more like it. At last. Frostborn hunger.
Monster kill.
Speak. Glory to the scourge. This is more like it. At last. Frostborn hungers. At last. Frostborn hunger. At last. Now, Frostborn. This is more like it. Finally. Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. At last. This is more like it. At last. Frostborn.
Godlike.
life, Bonezu. What is it now?
Aye.
What is your wish?
Tread lightly. No one orders me around. Ah, at last. Frostmourne hungers. At last.
Our
This is
forces
more
are under attack.
At last. This is more like it. What is it? Frostmourne hunger. No one wants me around. At last. Finally. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it. Finally. Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers.
Our brethren's town is under
This
attack.
is more like it. Finally. Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it. Finally. At last. At last. Finally. Frostmourne hungers.
Our brethren's town is under
Double
attack.
kill.
Finally.
Killing
This
spree.
is more like it. Finally. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it. At last. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers.
Our
What is it
brethren's
now?
town is under attack.
Speak, fool. No one orders me around. At last. What is it now?
Our brethren's town is under attack.
Frostmourne hungers. Finally. Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it. At last. This is more like it. Faithless coward. Your pain is faithless coward. No one orders me around. Frostmourne hungers. At last. Frostmourne hungers. Finally. This is more like it. Finally. This is more like it. At last.
Our brethren's town is under attack.
What is it now? It. Tread lightly. Speak, fool. For the Ricin. At last. Your pain will let you. Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it. At last. No one orders me around. At last. This is finally. Speak. This is Frostmourne hungers. At last. Frostmourne hungers.
I'll have it up in no time.
Tread lightly. This is more like. At last. This is Frostmourne hunger. like it. Ah, at last.
You're interrupting my calculations.
No one orders me around. Finally. Ah, at last. Finally.
What is it? 2 plus 3 times... What do you want?
What is it now? This is more like it. Ah, at last. Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. Speak. No one orders me around. Ah, at last. Finally. Oh, son. Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. Ah, at last.
Town is under attack.
Frostborn hungers. This is more like it.
What? No, 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 not like that. Let me do it.
Where shall my blood be spilled? Tread lightly. This is more like it. Ah, at last. This is at last. This is no one orders me around. This is more like it. Ah, at last. Frostborn hungers. Ah, at last. Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. Finally. What is it now? Ah, at last. This is more like it. Ah, at last. This is more like it. Finally.
Our central town is under attack.
At last. Finally. Frostborn hungers. Finally.
Our brethren's town is under
This
attack.
is more like
Dominating.
glory to the scourge. Frostborn hungers. This is more like finally. Your pain shall be lit.
Our brethren's town is under
Frostborn
attack.
hungers. At last. Finally. At last. This is more like it. Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. No one orders me around. Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. Frostborn hungers. At last. Frostborn hungers. At last. Frostborn hungers. Finally. Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. Frostborn hungers. At last. Finally. Frostborn hungers. Faithless coward. Finally. Frostborn hungers. You will know endless. Finally. At last. This is more like it. At last. Frostborn hungers. Finally. Frostborn hungers. At last. Frostmourne hungers. Tread lightly.
Your pain shall be legendary.
Finally.
I bow to your will.
What is it now?
Our forces are under
Speak,
attack.
fool. At last. Frostmourne hungers. Finally. This is more like it. What is it now?
More gold is required.
Speak, fool. Finally. This is more like it. What is it now? Frostmourne hungers. Finally. Frostmourne hungers. At last. Finally. At last. This is more like it. Finally. At last. Finally. This is more like it. At last.
Our reverence town is under attack.
Frostmourne hungers. At last. Finally.
Double kill.
Our brethren's town is under attack.
Double kill.
No one orders me. Speak, fool. What is it now? Tread lightly. This is more like it. Speak, fool. At last. What is it now? Tread lightly. Speak, fool. This is more like it. Finally. At last. Finally. At last. Finally. This is more like it. Frostmourne hunger. This is more like it. Finally. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. Frostmourne hungers. Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it. Finally. This is more like it. At last. Finally. What is it now? At last. Finally.
Our brethren's town is under
This
attack.
is more like it. At last. Finally. This is more like it. At last. Frostmourne hunger.
Double kill.
Our brethren's town is under attack.
Dominating. Triple kill.
Tread lightly. What is it now? This is more like it. Ah, at last. Finally. This is more like it. Ah, at last. No one orders me around. I'll make sure you suffer. What is it now? For religion. Finally. This is more like it. Your pain shall be legendary. I'll make sure you suffer. Speak, fool. Ah, at last. Frostborn hungers. Finally. Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. Finally. Tread lightly. Ah, at last. Finally. Ah, at last.
Our forces are under attack.
Frostborn hungers. Ah, at last.
Unstoppable double kill.
Our reverend town is under attack.
Wicked sick.
Our brethren's town is under attack.
No one orders me.
Our brethren's town is under attack.
Speak. Frostborn hungers. You will be ended. Frostborn hungers. Finally. This is more like it. Finally. Frostborn hungers. No one orders me around. This is more like it. Finally. At last. Finally. Now Frostborn hungers. You will be ended. Ah, at last.
Our brethren's town is under attack.
Ah, at last. This is more like it. Speak. Frostborn hungers. Ah, at last.
Monster kill.
Frostborn hungers.
Our brethren's town is under attack.
What is it now?
What is your wish?
No one orders me around. I'll make sure you suffer. Finally. This is more
Our brethren's town is under attack.
at last. Frostborn hungers. Tread lightly.
Our brethren's
at
town
last.
is under attack.
Speak, fool. Finally. Frostborn hungers. This is at last.
Our brethren's town is under attack. Our brethren's town is under attack.
What is it now? Finally. Tread lightly. Speak, fool. No one orders people around. Ah, at last. Frostmourne hungers. Speak. Finally. What is it now? Ah, at last. Tread lightly. Ah, at last. This is more like it. Ah, at last. Frostmourne hungers. Speak, fool. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. Ah, at last. This is more like it. Ah, at last. Frostmourne hungers. Ah, at last. Frostmourne hungers. Finally. Ah, at last. This is more like it.
Our brethren's town is under attack.
This is more like it. Frostmourne.
Mega kill. Double kill.
Ah, at last. This is more like it.
Initiating shutdown sequence.